All right, Crim 20, let us knock out chapter 15, which is probably one of my favorite ones in this whole course. It's really interesting. It's a really kind of a deep, deep topic. I was able to, during all my time sitting here at home doing nothing for the past 6 weeks, see a movie the other night called Just Mercy. It talked a lot about legal issues and the death penalty. It is, I think you can get it at Redbox, and it's like, like $2 or something like that. But it's a relatively new movie and really interesting. So if you get a chance, check it out. But legal issues and the death penalty. Okay, there we go. Okay. So until about 50 years ago, I think we've talked about this before, inmates had 0 rights. Inmates were considered slaves of the state. And the hands-off doctrine that we've talked about before completely supported this. So up until 1964, inmates had 0 rights. As soon as they went into that correctional facility, they no longer were protected by the Constitution, by the Bill of Rights. They were protected by nothing, and they were basically at the mercy of the correctional facility. 1964, that changed. The hands-off doctrine was lifted, and the courts started to become again involved in legal issues, mostly regarding violations of civil rights, but they were able to get involved much more so in the prisons and prison life than they were before that. So the United States Constitution and Bill of Rights are obviously the framework which form the rights that we have here in society, but it also forms the rights that inmates have. Now, they have limited rights, so they're not going to be exactly the same as what we have, but for the most part, inmates also, they have the right to free speech to a certain extent. They have a right to religious freedom to a certain extent. They do not have the right to privacy. That's kind of one of those things that the issue is the safety of the facility above all, and search and seizure and privacy rights are things that inmates really typically don't have. But other than that, they have the right to be treated, like human beings, except for that one minor issue, the search and seizure. So they have freedom from cruel and unusual punishment. What is that? It means different things to different people. I'm pretty sure I mentioned this case before, but there was a man who was in custody in Delaware. This happened a couple years ago. He sued the Delaware Department of Corrections because he said that the food that they were making him eat was basically inhumane, and that constituted cruel and unusual punishment. Well, what he had to eat was something called the prison loaf. And the prison loaf was basically all of the nutrients that were needed for that day were ground into, kind of thrown into a blender and baked into a loaf and given to him. Now, was it given to him as punishment? It was. He was gassing officers, meaning he was throwing semen, urine, feces, whatever, at officers when they would come and feed him. So his punishment was eat the prison loaf. So he said, basically, I've been eating the prison loaf for 6 weeks. This is cruel and unusual punishment. So, and it did make its way to court. The correctional facility was able to give the courts a little bit more information about what was happening. As soon as he would be lifted from the prison loaf, meaning like he had served his time, maybe I think it was 2 weeks at a time, he would be given real food again, and he would immediately gas the officers again. So ultimately, I know, and I like to ask this question in a classroom, but what do you think happened? Did he win? Was it considered cruel and unusual punishment, having to eat the prison loaf? I'm guessing it was pretty gross, but it was nothing that was going to make him sick, and had plenty of nutrients to keep him alive. And he did not win that. He did not win that case. But anyways, cruel and unusual punishment means different things to different people. You have the right to due process. Even if you're being punished within a correctional facility, you have a right to due process. Religious freedom. Now, are they going to let you slaughter a goat or practice, polygamy or things like that? No, they want to keep their facilities safe, but within reason, they are going to allow for some religious freedom. They have the right to have medical care, free speech, again, within reason. They can't incite a riot, but within reason, they have free speech. They have access to the courts, but there are limits there too. As you can imagine, if some inmates would sit in their cells and file lawsuits all day long if they could. So there are limits to how many lawsuits that they can file, and there is due process for inmate discipline. If they get in trouble in the facility and they're punished, they have the right to due process. So they can have higher-ups look at the issue and see if it was fair. So in 1935, there were 199 executions. In 1972, there was a short moratorium on the death penalty. This is the time when Charles Manson committed all of his crimes, 1972. They also ordered at that time that there be bifurcated trials for death penalty cases. Now, what the heck does that mean? That means there were two phases in the court proceedings. The first phase was simply the guilt or innocence of the offender. The second phase was the death penalty phase, should this offender get death or life without parole. So it is called a bifurcated case. The jury, the same jury, will hear the entire trial, and then they will be there for the death penalty portion as well. And that jury is going to decide whether or not that inmate is put to death. That is the only time a jury is involved in sentencing, is during a death penalty case. So in 2002, which was really not that long ago, the courts finally ordered that the mentally retarded, and that's their word, not mine, were not eligible for death. And then in 2004, again, not that long ago, the courts ruled that you had to have been at least 18 at the time the offense was committed in order to be put to death or eligible for death. Okay? So these are all kind of important, so keep these in mind. As of 2013, 35 states and the federal government allow for the death penalty. Your book has a chart in it on page 435, if you happen to have the book. I know that as of 2013, California was still one of those states. As of right now, we have a moratorium in the state of California, so the death penalty is halted as long as Governor Newsom is in office, and the next governor after him might very well decide that the death penalty is inhumane as well. It is not illegal in California, but it is there is a moratorium on it. So people still can be sentenced to death. They're just not being put to death. I don't know if that makes sense. Okay, what else? The most common form of death or method of death is lethal injection. But some states do still allow for the firing squad, hanging, gas chamber, and electrocution. I don't know why that's not on there, but electrocution is another one. California, in California, if we did have the death penalty right now, California offers lethal injection or gas chamber. If you did not watch that video for extra credit, you absolutely should, because it's a documentary about the death penalty. And it's posted under extra credit for Crim 20. So, Texas executes the most since 1977, 580, as opposed to California with 13. And California hasn't put anyone to death since, I believe, 2005. I think that was the last one. What is the reason for the death penalty? Deterrence. Okay, so if you find out that someone else was put to death because they committed a murder, would you be less likely to do it? I don't know the answer to that, but that's one of the arguments. Retribution. Imagine your loved one was killed by someone else. Would it make you feel better that that person was put to death? Again, I don't know the answer to this question, but that's another argument. Incapacitation. If someone's put to death, they are definitely never going to commit another crime. And cost. Some people would say that it's less expensive to keep them alive than it is to put people to death. I think that the price is pretty close. The cost between putting someone to death because of all the legal fees with all the appeals versus keeping someone alive. So anyways, these are the reasons. And, you know, people are either before it or against, are either for it or against. And, you know, when we're talking about it, I always like try to consider the fact, consider the family of the offender and consider the family of the victim when you're trying to consider whether it's reasonable. And it kind of depends on whose shoes you're in as to how you feel about it. But there have been people released from prison after being on death row for murder. So there is a potential for error, and people have been put to death and later found not guilty. So yeah, it's tough. So I think that's it. All right, we're done.